Many of you didn't know it, but The Last of Us, HBO's new hit series, was a video game before it came into the small screen. While not critically acclaimed, it has been widely accepted as one of the best video game adaptations ever made, not only because of its high production value that includes great actors, set design and VFX, but also because it manages to successfully imprint the message that the source material told more than a decade ago in a completely different format. But what can people learn from the success of the show on how to adapt a video game? Gameplay is padding, but it should not be ignored. The first thing I'll talk about is that when it comes to analyzing a single-player video game, the gameplay itself is nothing but padding, especially if you see the game as a story-focused product, as there would be no game if you only had to jump from plot point to plot point. While this form of interactivity is essential for video games, it also gets in the way of telling the story, with players being able to postpone the main mission for as long as they want, including finishing virtually every objective before having to continue with the plot. If we analyze The Last of Us, most of the big story moments, beyond the very early ones, have nothing to do with the zombies, but with how the apocalypse only exacerbated the most intense instincts of humanity. Quite fitting. Whether those instincts that lead us through the world of growth and comprehension, or the ones that degrade us back to our most basic and violent roots. This has become one of the main discussion points surrounding HBO's adaptation, as most of these zombie moments have been completely erased for not adding enough substance. This is both a great thing and a not so great thing. While it is a smart choice for the show, especially because we know that most TV and movie directors end up crafting the most cringe-worthy stuff when trying to adapt gameplay sections into their productions, it is also important to remember that the virus is what sets the story into motion. It might not need to be as relevant in the adaptation, but it also should not be used just as a way of moving the plot forward, when the writers remember that zombies were actually a big part of this world. Let's not forget that this aspect of the story was a huge part of the overall marketing campaign of the adaptation, so it's completely comprehensible that some people might feel a little disappointed, especially those who have not played the games. Beats defeat structure. While the show didn't change as much as some people might have expected, it changed enough to give a little more life to the overall lore, empowering some of the stories that were not a big part of the game, and cutting down those that held minimal to no impact in the overall progression of the plot. The show changes its structure drastically, but its story beats remain largely the same. It also helps that The Last of Us is a pretty straightforward body trip, and not an extremely intricate drama about revenge, time travel, or boss killing. From episodes 3 to 6, the show adapts important bits of the story, such as Bill's impact on Joel and Ellie's journey, the harsh nature of communities outside of QZs, Henry and Sam's dramatic demise and its impact on the main character's relationship, and Joel's final acceptance of Ellie as his putative daughter. Does this by trimming down and even completely erasing huge areas and moments, almost 50% of the game, from Chapter 3, The Outskirts, to Chapter 7, Tommy's Dam. If you're the type of fan that wanted a more scene-by-scene adaptation of the game, which is completely valid, the show might not feel as close to home as you might have wanted it to. But to its own credit, this strategy manages to eliminate as much fat as possible. Gameplay is padding, leaving a final product that is able to tell a much more cohesive and coherent story. And why is that? Because they prioritize the beats of the source material over its structure. Same cannot be said about the pacing, with a couple of episodes feeling like they came out of nowhere to tell us stories that break the flow of the season. Funnily enough, this is mainly caused by two of the best episodes in the show, which are 3, Bill's story, and 7, Ellie's story. While these are good episodes on their own regard, they not only put a hold on the main plot, but also do it in order to answer questions that are not relevant for that specific moment of the story. In the game, Bill's influence on the overall plot is small, but directly tied with Joel and Ellie's mission. On the other hand, Ellie's backstory is part of a DLC that you can play whenever you want, or that you might have even missed if you played the game when it came out and you never touched it again. While essential to add subtext, both these stories fail to truly connect with what's going on in the show. Joel escorting Ellie to the nearest Firefly HQ in order to get her blood checked. Bill's story seems especially unimportant to the plot, as its only contribution is helping Pedro Pascal take a shower and get a car so they can cruise on to the next episode. Again, as little stories within the source material's lore created to make it more relatable, humane, and rich, these episodes work great, but they do no favors to the actual pacing of the show. Nevertheless, remember what the show taught us. Beats defeat structure, and with most of the story beats being successfully adapted into the show, these space-breaking moments don't feel like a chore. tone, or essence is difficult to adapt. While the adaptation was faithful enough, including not only Easter eggs that transported the viewer into the world of the game, but also a barrage of beautifully planned shots that recreated some of the more impacting moments of the source material, it seemed to me that the show had a hard time capturing the essence of certain sections of the game, especially the darker, more realistic moments. I felt it was especially obvious in episode 8, which was by far my least favorite one. It's the only episode where the changes felt like taking away from the characters and the situation, as well as poorly emulating the events of the game. Up to this point, amongst the most talked about episodes, we've had one that takes just a few notes from the source material to create an engaging and beautiful story, and another one that recreates almost bit by bit a full chunk of the game in order to create an experience as faithful as possible. Episode 8 somehow does neither, adding new stuff that is not up to par with the rest of the show, let alone the game, and being unable to figure out how to properly adapt the most survival horror-y section of the game. In the source material, David is nothing but the leader of a group of survivors that mistakenly picked Hannibal Lecter's cookbook when looking for a different criminal's cookbook. In the show, he is the leader of some sort of post-apocalyptic Christian cult that is going through some tough times. He too read Hannibal's cookbook, but in this case, he also has delusions of grandeur, speaking about how he found God in the cordyceps and violence or something like that. It's convoluted and cringy, and it ends up meaning nothing as he and his goons die because he decided it was a good idea to risk it all for a teenager, making it especially dumb when you realize that he had just stumbled upon a venison, a horse, and 2 humans that could have fed the camp for at least a month. In that same episode, Ellie survives this with just a minor bruise, Joel kills 3 men while being convalescent, and somehow a community of around 30 people decided not to go and check why their town center was on fire. To a degree, this also happens in the game, but my main issue is that, like in a couple of other moments of the show, the writers decided it was a good idea to sprinkle a little more superficial drama, like in episode 1 where they chose to give Joel some PTSD flashbacks by sacrificing the more simple yet impactful moments of the story, like in episode 1 where the revelation that Ellie is immune is basically brushed off in order to show Joel beating the living crap out of the guard because he was having his PTSD flashbacks. Also regarding the tone of the episode, HBO's Joel didn't come across as too much of a psycho. In this section of the game is when we start to realize that Joel might just be a little more twisted than we previously thought. I mean, look at my boy's expression here, he's just letting it all out. In the show, his character feels diluted, acting like a tired old man who's only trying to get by, or in this case, a man with an acute infection that has no business killing 3 full-grown men. Also, in the game, we are in the middle of this dark and cruel winter, with people barely being able to walk outside without freezing to death. In the show, it's sunny and breezy, almost as if inviting us to visit the snowy sides of wherever the hell they're supposed to be. While I believe it's important that adaptations are not just shot-by-shot recreations of the source material, plenty of the new stuff they added to the story felt like it didn't belong in the same universe, making the story less relatable and way more melodramatic. Another part of the show that has the same problems is everything related to Rose from 2.5 Men, which felt like a parody of every careless, motivationless, and pointless villain we've seen in B-movies. Her death is even worse. That kid must have weighed like 15 kilos. That's around 45 feet or 72 fat-ass hands for those of you watching from the US. It couldn't have been that difficult to evade her as she jumped. TV is the right format. Most of the times. I left this point for last as I believe it's the most obvious one. While a good movie can tell a compelling story in just a couple of hours, most video games tell stories that are way too long to be compressed into a short script. That, mixed with producers, writers, and directors that have no respect for the source material, is one of the reasons why we've had so many horrible video games adaptations in the past. Shows are not impervious to this, as we've seen plenty of times, but at least the format gives a little more leeway to those who are actually trying to create respectful adaptations that bring video game stories into the mainstream. What makes HBO's The Last of Us so special is that it's one of the few shows that has actually tried to tell the same story as the one in the video game, with the only other example I can think of being Steins Gate. Instead of either creating a spin-off, like Cyberpunk Edge Runners, or just taking the most basic elements of the IP in order to make a whole new story, like Arcane. Doesn't mean that The Last of Us has more merit than those other shows, but it helps prove wrong what storytelling purists have been yapping on for the last couple of decades. Video games can, and have been for many years, tell beautiful and complex stories that do not need to be Hollywoodized in order to to be enjoyed by everyone. HBO produced the show, so I kind of always had faith in it at least not sucking, but what they presented to us is not only a good seasonal show, but yet another example that there's not such a thing as a video game adaptation curse, just inept people who have cursed the media with their shitty adaptations. It's not perfect, because nothing is perfect, but it is a solid recreation that capitalizes on what made the original game so popular when it came out. Way too many people having a Daddy King.